So here we have E-mu Proteus II, an orchestral synthesizer, and has also a lot more of the traditional synthesizer sounds as well. Introduced in 1990 as part of the Proteus family, about 20 Proteus instruments in all from E-mu. And the first one was the pop rock version 1989. This one is from 1990. They're really quite sought after now. They were used in many scores, games, and films at the time. 125 tones, some of them stereo, 192 presets, 64 of which are editable, 32 voice polyphony with 16-bit resolution, and many of these sounds, if not all of them, were taken from the Emulator 3, which at the time was a lot of money, thousands and thousands of dollars. This was put on the market for much less than that, and well within the reach of certainly commercial studios, home studios, and hobbyists. And it became very, very, very popular indeed, used in a lot of films of that period and computer games as well. One of the stock sounds on here, Whistling Joe, patch number 125, is that whistling sound from the X-Files at the beginning of there. Great fun to play with, great fun to edit, very, very simple editing. Although it looks like a menu diver, it's not really. There's a little bit of menu diving, but certainly nothing as complex as some of the some other instruments around, particularly today. So getting into this machine is fairly straightforward. Just some clips here, clips on the back. These are plastic clips inside with a very limited metal frame. Very easy to snap these clips off when you take it apart, so please be careful. You can see on the edges here and on the other side, I've drilled through and put some small bolts glued to the metal frame, and then these, some small nuts glued to the metal frame. These bolts go through and attach the nuts just to secure it. They're not terribly tight, it's just to secure the lid on, because without them, the previous owner had taken this apart and snapped almost all of the clips, so the top wouldn't hold. So let's take the top off and have a look. So here we have the inside of the Proteus 2, fairly straightforward machine, main circuit board. This is the additional ROM for the waveforms for the orchestra version, and that just clips on. If you need to take the whole of the circuit board out, undo this screw. These clips will allow you to take this top ROM board out, and then you can take out the bottom board completely. So what happened with this machine? It was on reverb. I bought it for, I think, about $30. The power supply was completely blown. As many of you know, you can often resurrect these power supplies by changing some of the capacitors, particularly the high voltage ones. After 30, where are we now, 32 years of use, these will often be more dried out and they won't have the same ESR and capacitance. So these, to be honest, routinely replace them once I get into a machine of this age, even if they look good. There's probably no need to, it's just whilst I'm there, why not? The other thing to change is the battery. A lot of machines slightly after this era came with coin batteries with a coin battery holder. Sometimes there are coin batteries hard soldered onto the board, always worth changing a battery. So I got this battery from Synth Parts and took a week or so to arrive, took out the old one, put in the new one, obviously make sure the polarity is correct, soldered it in, and we're good to go for another 30 odd years. So the power supply in this machine that I bought had been, somebody had attempted to repair it already. One of the things that gave that away, as you can see from this photo, is that the power supply board was slightly at an angle and the screws weren't there to hold it in place. So that told me immediately somebody had had it apart. And it also told me that the likely culprit for the machine not working was the power supply board, which I'm quite comfortable repairing and with a little bit of research replacing also. So the other thing that I tend to change with this sort of age of machine is the screen. And I picked up a very nice OLED display. I'll show you when we record the demo tune. OLED display goes in here with just a small amount of work. Knobs come off on the front. Underneath the volume knob is a nut, which is actually quite tricky to get out, but once it's out, the front panel just pops off. You can then take the original screen out and put the new screen in. Now, not only does that make it much brighter, as you'll see, one of the primary reasons for replacing these screens is that the electroluminescent light behind the screen tends to fade with time, and after 30 years, often they're completely failed, and you have very, very limited visibility of what's on the screen. The OLED screens are awesome. I replace almost all synths I get my hands on with an OLED screen. Very cheap, somewhere between $10–15 for this one. Sometimes for some of the larger machines I have, like the JD990 M1 REX, O1RW, those are very specific screens, and they're quite a bit more expensive, $80–90, but well worth it. So this power supply I replaced, and I will run through the replacement of that now because it wasn't straightforward. If you look at this ribbon cable, you can see it looks a bit of a mangle. It's not actually quite a mangle. It was very tricky to put in because the voltage rails on here and the voltage input rails on here were different. Of course they were, because this is a replacement power supply from a different manufacturer, and you've got to spend some time with a piece of paper and a pen working out exactly where the power rails need to go. So there we go. I'll take you through just a few pictures now and explain it all, and you'll hopefully be able to understand how to put a new power supply in. This power supply cost me 15 Australian dollars, came from Australia, and it went in and the machine just lit up in life immediately with absolutely nothing wrong with it. And for a 30–40 US dollar purchase and another 20 Australian dollars to fix it, what a bargain, absolute bargain. Which is why I tend to keep them, because they sound great, and for what is effectively about 50 US dollars, I've got one of the classic machines from the late 80s, early 90s. So I'll explain the power supply now. So here you can see the pictures that were on Reverb when I looked at the listing, and you can see obviously the main board as you saw earlier on the video. The old batteries obviously there, nothing really much changed, but if you look at the power supply, it's very clear that that is not quite in alignment with the case, and there's only one screw in there. There's a little bit of a close-up in a second. So this is the main board. Obviously you can see the expansion board, nothing really to see there. You know, the capacitors, for what's worth, they look fine. And here we have the power board. Now I think you'll notice straight away in the top right there's no fuse, and that was initially my thought. There might be a quick fix for a few pence, put a fuse in there and it'll work again. That wasn't the case, and took the board out, replaced the capacitors, tested a few bits and pieces, and it became very clear then that secondary coil on the transformer had gone. It was open, and trying to change that is too much work. It's too much hassle trying to find replacement parts. So really that power supply was dead. Now, the power supply is made by a company called Skynet, and for those of you of a certain age, you'll remember the Terminator was made by Skynet. A little concerning that Skynet actually exists in real life. Anyway, this board is possible to be found on eBay. It comes in about £80–90 or around that sort of $100 mark, which really is the majority of the cost of one of these E-mus, and it's really not worth trying to locate one of these and put it in to replace a broken one. So you can see on the back of the transformer, you can see the model E-mu 3031. That's the sort of the E-mu model number of the Skynet board, and you can see there that under DC output, voltage rail 1 is plus 5 volts, voltage rail 2 plus 12, and then voltage rail 3 is minus 12 volts. Now when you look at the 6 pins, you have 1 through 6, 1 on the right of the Molex connector. Sorry, the very right of the Molex connector is pin 1, the very left is pin 6. Now on this model of, on this Skynet power supply that the E-mu was using for Proteus, you find that pin or voltage rail 1 is on pin 1 and 2. So out of the 6 pins, pin 1 and 2 is plus 5 volts, pin 3 and 4 is ground, pin 5 minus 12 volts, and pin 6 plus 12 volts. Now there's a number of different models of this particular power supply, and basically they're different voltage rails. You can see here the one that you want from Skynet is SNP 9031, which, like I say, is, you can find it, but it's expensive, probably not far off the cost of a replacement Proteus E-mu on second-hand market. So is there a replacement? Well, yes there is, and it's absolutely bang on. The Meanwhile PT45, and it's the PT45B, as you can see here, has got the same voltage rails, plus 5, plus 12, minus 12, on channels 1, 2 and 3. This is about $18 in Australia, and I've just checked it again this afternoon. It's trading on for about $18, fairly openly available. I bought this and it took about a week to 10 days to get to me, which is just fine. And you can see it's got the correct voltages. Now, the one problem that you've got is that the voltage rails come out on different pins. That's a little bit of a problem. There's a workaround, but it is difficult to do it so that you're certain that you're not going to have a problem. So if you look at the original board, you've got the ribbon connector from the Molex of the power supply on the left-hand side there, and it's going flat and straight into the board onto the main circuit board. So pin 1 goes to pin 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3, etc., etc., 6 to 6. The first thing we need to look at, however, is the power supply coming into the power supply board. On the right hand side you can see the two wires, neutral and earth, coming from the power switch, and that supplies the 240 volts to the power supply board. Now if you look at the Molex connector, you can see the clip of the Molex connector on the original board is on the inside of the power supply board. You can see it a little bit clearer on this picture. The input for the mains is on the left of the board, and the clip you can see is on the inside of the Molex connector. Now if you look at a similar picture of the replacement power supply from Meanwhile, you can see that clip is on the outside of the board, closest to the edge. So what we need to do is change this clip where the connector is on the the little securing clip is on the inside of the board, to this with the securing clip on the outside of the board. Now in fact the easiest way to do that is not to change the clip on the board. You can't change that. The easiest thing to do is to change the wiring on the connector. Now the cable coming in with the neutral and the live needs to have the pins swapped around, so that when the connector from the power switch is switched 180 degrees, you still have the live coming into the same pin on the Meanwhile board as was on the original power supply board. So I say again, what you need to do with the power supply coming into the power supply board is on the connector from the switch, change the two cables around. That could be done fairly easily with a very, very small screwdriver or paper clip or something like this. Just poked up into the two clips on the Molex connector, and just unsecure them, pull them out, swap them over, pop them back in, and then connect that connector from the switch to the power supply board. Obviously please make sure the mains is off when you do this. If you stick a paper clip into a live wire, it's going to hurt, if not do you more damage. Potentially mains voltage can kill, so please be careful. Don't just turn it off, disconnect it from the power supply and leave it for a little while, a few minutes, so that you don't have any residual power in some of the capacitors and what have you, if you happen to touch those with anything that you're using to change these pins around. If that seems a little confusing or you want some clarity, please pop a question down below and I'll come back to you with a further explanation. Now if you look at the specification of the original power supply, you can see pin 1 at the top on the diagram of the board, going down to pin 6 at the bottom, +5, ground, ground, -12, +12. Now you look at the Meanwhile replacement, and +1 is +12 volts. So pin 1 is +12 volts, pin 2 and 3 is +5, pin 4 and 5 is ground, pin 6 is -12 volts. So let's look at this a little bit again and let's try and make it a little bit clearer. So you've got +5 volts on pin 1 and 2 on the original Skynet circuit board, pin 3 and 4 ground, -12 on pin 5, +12 on pin 6. And that's why the ribbon cable is nice and flat. Now correspondingly, on the contacts on the main circuit board, on the solder points, the voltage rails coming in corresponds to each of those points. Now if you look at the Meanwhile power supply, as you've probably already picked up, the voltage rails are on different pins. So pin 1 is plus 12 volts, pin 2 and 3 plus 5 volts, pin 4 and 5 ground, pin 6 minus 12 volts. So you have to do some chopping around. Now, the easiest way to do this, I thought about taking the Molex connector off, but actually that's very difficult off the power supply. The easiest way to do it is to desolder the ribbon cable from the main circuit board. I just use some scissors to cut up between each cable. There's a neat little mark on there that you can use. Strip the wires back and very carefully worked out which of the Molex pins corresponded to which lead, and then soldered them into the correct hole on the main circuit board. And you can see here the outcome of this. I've cut back the lead, separated each lead by a good 2 or 3 inches, and then very carefully soldered them back in so that the power rails coming from the new power supply matched the original power rails from the Skynet supply. And you'll see here, this is the power supply expected by the main power board. So you've got plus 12, minus 12 on pin 5, pin 4 and 3 ground, and pin 2 and 1 plus 5 volts. So let's take that one step further. So you've got the power rails expected by the main board, and then on the replacement power supply you can see none of the colours match up. This is where it becomes a little bit tricky. So pin 1 goes to pin 6. Okay, that's reasonably straightforward, and you can see why you need to cut the cables in between, not just to get them in the right place, but also to ensure that they're flat enough to be housed in the 1-rack unit. Pin 2 and 3 go to pin 1 and 2. Pin 4 and 5 goes to pin 3 and 4. And pin 6 goes to pin 5. So that's how to wire in a Meanwell power supply into an E-mu Proteus. And believe me, that bit of it was, I had to get a piece of paper, sit down and work it out. And believe me, I felt like this turning it on, but I turned it on and it worked. For an $18 power supply, you can't go wrong for a $30 synth to have something that's up and running and as good as new. So that was the Proteus 2 along with the factory demo. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please subscribe and like, and hopefully I'll be able to bring you another video soon. Please leave any requests below, and hopefully I'll be able to encompass one of those in future videos, and see you soon. Cheers.